At the height of their power, the elves accomplished some pretty impressive feats, from building great kingdoms to crafting powerful weapons and jewelry, and even defeating mighty evil creatures. From their creation in the First Age to their decline in the Third Age, the elves were always a force for good. Well, mostly. And narrowing them down for a list like this was extremely difficult. These are in no particular order, although I have saved my personal top pick for last, but here is a list for who we consider to be the most powerful elves in Middle-earth.
Build me an army worthy of Mordor.
So when looking at criteria for this list, it was difficult to narrow it down based purely on skills in combat, as the elves are a race well known for producing a tremendous number of skilled and dangerous warriors. They sort of have the unfair advantage of having thousands of years to refine their skills, but either way, it was tough. So the fairest way I could think to judge them was to look at the ones that face supernatural enemies with might and power far superior to their own. There may be some elves that definitely deserve to be on this list, but perhaps they were never given the opportunity to show the true extent of their power. So let's get started. We will begin with one of the most obvious, Galadriel. Now, many people that are mainly just fans of The Lord of the Rings may not know the extent of Galadriel's power. She is on this list for a number of reasons, and while this video isn't meant to be a history of each of these characters, I will give you a very brief rundown of what makes the Lady of Light so powerful. In the Third Age, she is described by Tolkien as being the mightiest and fairest of all elves that remained in Middle-earth. She actually witnessed 3 ages of the sun in Middle-earth, having been born during the years of the trees. She is actually one of the oldest elves still remaining in Middle-earth. She was born in Valinor as one of the Noldor. She was the daughter of Finarfin and the younger sister of Finrod, and she supported Fëanor during the exile of the Noldor. Now, while all this may not seem like a big deal to many, just being one of the Noldor is actually of great importance. They were perhaps the most powerful people to ever walk Middle-earth. They crafted some of the most important weapons that we know of, including Orcrist, Glamdrin, and Sting, the Palantir, and they even played a part in forging the Rings of Power. The Noldor are, in short, a pretty big deal, and Galadriel is considered one of their leaders. Not only that, but she was also the bearer of one of the 3 Elven Rings of Power, which would help preserve and maintain her great power. And let us not forget that she was one of the ones responsible for driving Saron out of Dol Guldur. Saron is a Maya. He is a being far beyond that of any elf or human. Of course, by the time that Galadriel confronts him, he is not at full strength, and probably planned on returning to Mordor anyway, but the banishment of Saron is a great achievement for any individual, no matter the circumstance. Even if he wanted to remain in Dol Guldur, he most likely wouldn't have been able to withstand the power of Galadriel. She is definitely one of, if not the only being that could have done so. Her spot on this list is indisputable. Next up we have Fëanor. Now, while at times Fëanor was selfish, paranoid, and a pretty terrible brother, he accomplished some pretty amazing things during his life. One of which is creating the Silmarils, the most precious and sought after gems in all of Arda, and the Palantiri. It is said that Fëanor was made the mightiest in all parts of body and mind, but his personality had flaws. Towards the end of his great life, he was camped at Lake Mithrim with his army when he was attacked by a great force of Morgoth. The Noldor elves, led by Fëanor, defeated the enemy force with relative ease, despite being heavily outnumbered. But then after, Fëanor in his rage marched on towards Angband. And when coming within sight of the great gates of the fortress of Morgoth, he was ambushed by a group of Balrogs. With few elves by his side, he fought them alone bravely, but it wasn't long before Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, joined the battle. A character you may now be more familiar with if you watched last week's video on him. Gothmog fatally wounded Fëanor and he died soon after their battle. But being able to hold his own, not only against a Balrog, but multiple Balrogs, shows just how powerful Fëanor was, justifying his position on this list. Now, he did of course complete many other very impressive feats, but as I said previously, this isn't a history of each character. I'm just justifying their place on this list. So next on said list, again this is not in any order, but we have chosen to go with Elrond. Now, Elrond is a direct descendant of a Maya, which gives him some degree of divine power, and like Galadriel, he also bears one of the 3 Elven Rings of Power. By the time of the War of the Ring, he is around 6,500 years old, and unlike some of the others on this list, is a tremendously experienced warrior, having been at war in some way with Sauron's forces for over 4,500 years. On top of all this, he was also pretty strong with elven magic, including healing and foresight, and he was arguably one of the greatest leaders of all elves. It's also worth mentioning that Aragorn actually thinks that Elrond would be capable of mentally resisting Sauron, which is praise that he shares only with Galadriel and Gandalf, who is, of course, a Maya. He has also been in a direct conflict with Sauron on 2 occasions, during the Battle of the Last Alliance, and he was also involved in the banishment of Sauron from Dol Guldur. Challenges don't get much bigger than that, and having been victorious both times says enough about Lord Elrond's power. Next up, we have chosen one of my favourite characters in all of Tolkien's Legendarium, Glorfindle. He was one of the mighty of the Firstborn Elves and Lord of the House of the Golden Flower in Gondolin. He fought in many of the major battles throughout the First Age, including the Battle of Gondolin in the year 510 of the First Age. He fought Melkor's forces bravely, alongside his fellow soldiers from the House of the Golden Flower, who were actually one of the last standing houses to fight. After the battle began to look like a lost cause for the Gondolindrim, they began to attempt their escape. As they were fleeing, a Balrog blocked their paths, but Glorfindle leapt in front to face it to give the others time to escape. He defended himself from the demon's whip and claws and successfully hewed its iron helm. And at the last moment, he pierced the belly of the Balrog, which caused it to fall backwards from the cliff. But it grabbed Glorfindle by the hair, and both of them fell deep into the abyss. Glorfindle's spirit departed to the Hall of Mandos, but due to his noble actions and saving the lives of countless elves, he was re-embodied after a short time and returned to Middle-earth as an emissary of the Valar, who granted him powers nearly as strong as that of a Maya. In his next term in Middle-earth, he was involved in more great battles, and even often fought the Witch King and the Nazgul. His place on this list cannot be disputed. Next we have the legendary Gil-galad. After the fall of Gondolin, he was made High King of the Noldor, and as I mentioned earlier, this was a pretty big deal. Then, after the destruction of Beleriand during the War of Wrath, Gil-galad founded the Kingdom of Lindon in the far northwest of Middle-earth, roughly between the Blue Mountains and the Great Sea. He was the last heir of the kings of the Noldor, and openly acknowledged as the High King of all elves of the West. In fact, many of the elves, both Noldor and Sindar, joined him. A lot of stuff happened following this, but this is about the strength of the character, again, not the full history. Although we do have a full video on Gil-galad if you're interested in the full story. But anyway, Gil-galad went on to be one of the bearers of the 3 Rings of Power, but most importantly, and this cannot be put into words of how impressive of a feat this is, Gil-galad and Elendil, leader of the Men of Númenor, joined forces and formed the last alliance of elves and men. Then, during the Battle of the Last Alliance, when the forces of good began pressing forward with their siege, a siege that had been going on for 7 years, Sauron had no choice but to join in the battle himself. He was then engaged by Elendil and Gil-galad in combat, and was defeated, but the leaders of the elves and men were also killed in the act. But just think about that. An elven king was able to stand toe-to-toe with Sauron, one of the most powerful Maya ever, and defeat him. Gil-galad was without a doubt one of the most powerful elves who ever lived, and I for one am really hoping we get to see more of him in the Amazon Prime show. Next we have selected Fingon. Fingon has been placed on this list for many reasons. He was another of the High Kings of the Noldor, which, if you haven't figured out yet, only seems to be a position that ends up with these legendary elven characters. Fingon was actually named the Valiant for his skill in battle. He was the son of Fingolfin, which is a pretty impressive bloodline in itself, and he led the largest host in the flight of the Noldor from Aman to Middle-earth. During the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, he fought with many Balrogs, including the Lord of the Balrogs, Gothmog. Now, he died in the process, but it took one Balrog to restrain him with a fiery whip, while Gothmog finished him off. A mighty elf indeed. So, we have 2 left on this list. First of the final 2 is Exelyon, leader of the people of the Fountain. Exelyon commanded a wing of Gondolin's forces during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. A pretty disastrous battle for the elves, but just surviving it says a lot about the might of this elven warrior. But his biggest and most legendary feat was during the fall of Gondolin. It is said that so terrible was his voice when commanding the drawing of the swords and the killings which followed, that his name became a terror among the enemy. It's also said that during this battle, Exelyon and his House of the Fountain killed more orcs than had ever been slain, in all the battle of elves and orcs combined. Exelyon then went on in this battle to kill not one, not two, but 3 Balrogs. He soon went to the Fountain of the King to drink from it and regain some strength, but it was here that he was confronted by Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs. They fought. Exelyon lost his sword, and as Gothmog was readying to finish him off, he ran towards the Balrog and drove the spike of his helmet into Gothmog's body. The two of them fell back into the fountain and both drowned. But it is safe to say that the actions of Exelyon during this battle likely changed the entire future of Middle-earth. For Gothmog's only equal in Middle-earth was Saron, so imagine Gothmog had survived into the Third Age and had allied with Saron. That could have been a much different outcome. Finally, we have the last elf on this list. And while it's not in any order, this is who I would pick to be the most powerful elf to ever live. But that, of course, is a very personal pick. So, we've gone with Fingolfin. So what makes us consider Fingolfin as such a powerful elven character? Well, he was the first High King of the Noldor in Beleriand. He was brother of Fëanor, Finarfin, Findis, and Irime, and was said to be the strongest and most valiant of all these brothers. He had many impressive feats, but we only need to talk about one here to justify his place on this list. After defeating the force of orcs at the Dagor Aglareb, or the Glorious Battle, Fingolfin maintained the siege of Angband for nearly 400 years, but the siege was ended by the assaults of Morgoth in the Dagor Bragollach, or the Battle of Sudden Flame, resulting in many people from Beleriand fleeing. And in the end, Fingolfin rode to Angband alone and called out Morgoth, challenging him to single combat. Now think about this. This is an elf, challenging Melkor, who is not only a Valar, but arguably the most powerful being to ever step foot in Middle-earth. Those who saw Fingolfin on this day thought that Arome himself had arrived, for a great rage was upon him. His eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. Now Morgoth could not refuse this challenge without losing face before his captains. So he put on his black armour, took up his great mace Grond, and emerged from the gates of Angband. Fingolfin drew his sword Ringil, and the duel began. Fingolfin managed to evade all of Morgoth's attacks, and wounded the Dark Lord 7 times. 7 times! But after a while Fingolfin began to grow tired, and Morgoth beat him to the ground 3 times. But each time the Elven King rose up and continued to fight. But, as Mandos had once foretold, no power of the elves could defeat Morgoth, a Valar. Eventually, Fingolfin fell backwards into one of the pits in the ground that was carved out by Morgoth's missed strikes with Grond. Morgoth then stepped on Fingolfin's neck and killed him. However, in one last desperate attempt, Fingolfin managed to cut deep into the Dark Lord's heel, and after the battle, he would walk with a limp and be in pain from his wounds forever. An incredible effort and display of not only power, but courage and will also. Fingolfin is easily my favourite elven character, and in my personal opinion, deserves to be at the top of this list, which, as I stated, is not in order. So that brings us to the end of this list, guys. My question for you today is a simple one. Who, if any, would you add to this list? Did we miss anyone out? Do you disagree with our choices? Or do you agree 100%? Let us know in your thoughts in the comments down below. Okay, so time has come, as always, to thank our patrons and channel members. You guys are absolutely amazing. An extra special shout out goes to the members of our highest tiers: Gregory Nashith, John, Andrew, Denver Steel, and Pirate747. And we want to shout out our limited special tier on Patreon: Kevin, Abram, Matt, and Glorfindle of Gondolin. As members of this tier, you of course all get executive producer roles on our film and will be able to give feedback on the story itself during pre-production, which we are currently approaching the end of. We've been over the moon with the positive feedback to the script, and we can't wait to get started with production. If you guys aren't aware, 100% of support on Patreon is going towards the budget of our short film, so if you want to support that film, that is how you can do so. Check us out on Patreon at The Broken Sword. A very quick reminder to check out our other channels, The Sixth Ranger and History of Dragon Ball, for some nostalgic Power Rangers and anime lore. The links will be in the description down below if they are of any interest to you. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you next time on The Broken Sword.